So I ran a poll on this channel the other day where I asked if people wanted to hear about sources of virtue and knowledge first or specific books. People wanted to hear books first, so I'm going to talk about them here. But first of all, I want to announce something based on the last stream. So I noticed that a lot of people were asking huge questions, be they specifically theological, historical, or even personal. So I gave it some thought and I figured, wouldn't it be a good idea if I made this into videos? Because I have like 3 videos a week roughly planned outside of Renaissance Man, and I figured I could give perhaps more detail to certain answers that I give in streams if I made them into videos themselves. So I'm announcing question time. Now, these will be irregular, they won't always be out every week, there may be 2 or 3 a week, dependent on the questions given. But I'll try and go into detail. So if you ask questions related to, complex things, so some people have asked about imputed versus imparted grace, for example. It can be anything, it could even be personal questions relating to, say, overcoming a vice. If you ask these questions, I'll take note of them, and I will comment to you and say, I'll make this into a video if I think it's big enough. Otherwise, I'll try and give you a comment. So, hopefully that's useful. But let's get into these books. One thing I did notice when I was establishing this list is how few books I've actually read. In my entire life, I've probably only read about 160, 170 books, or so. So, I haven't actually read that many. And I had some real problems picking them out, because I decided to exclude sacred scripture, because sacred scripture should be self-evident. And all of the books are of pretty much infinite value, so I decided to keep them out of there. I've also put some books on there that aren't the kind that you will read, because they're more specifically like, I flip through, I find a particular part that's very useful, and then I use that. But we'll get into that in the list. So let's start with the first one, which is the Confessions of St. Augustine. St. Augustine's Confessions are this weird amalgam of theology, but also this very deep personal story. It's probably the greatest work of medieval literature, perhaps ever, if you could count Augustine as living in the medieval age, which some people do. Very early medieval, late antiquity. It's worth reading purely just for the strength of his honesty, because he tells his life story in this very, very, somber and very, very sorrowful way. He goes even to the point of his birth to confess sins when he was below the age of reason, and he goes into detail about, stealing pears from an orchard just for the sake of it, and he laments this, even though he did this when he was a child. It's beautiful, and he confesses pretty much everything that a psyche can even comprehend. He even goes into details about, like, one thing I found particularly interesting was how he'd lie about his sexual exploits in order to get more attention from his friends, which is something I think a lot of men can relate to. And I think it's just so incredibly deep. But on top of this, it's also, as well as being very easy to relate to and a book that everyone should read, it also includes a lot of theology, because as he tells his stories, he articulates how he came to certain conclusions about theology and the nature of good and evil and such like that. And to an extent, although I haven't been doing it consciously, my channel is somewhat of a reflection of that. It's been me running up against intellectual problems and whacking into them, and then the conclusions spilling out from that. But he does it in such a succinct and beautiful way that I could never hope to even closely resemble it. The man was a genius, and not only was he a genius, he was an incredibly honest genius, and he's purely worth reading just for that. Like, honestly, you can get this book for about £2 or £3 in a second-hand bookshop. It's a very common book, but it's just so good. And even if you get an audiobook and listen through it, it's just so worth it. It's incredibly beautiful, and I'll probably still be reading it a millennia from now, because it's survived so far about 1,700 years for a reason. Or maybe 1,600, regardless. It's older than Islam, and there's a good reason why it's persisted. The second book I'm going to recommend is Skin in the Game by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Now, this was released within the last 2 years. This is a very, very new book. but I'm pretty convinced it will still be read in a couple of hundred years. I think that Nicholas Nassim Taleb is one of the few authors of the 21st century that will be read in subsequent centuries. He's got a certain quality to him that I really like. He's like a mixture between Seneca, if you've read his letters, and Michel de Montaigne, who he strongly recommends, and I've read, if you made him far more aggressive. He writes in a very aggressive way. He writes like I talk in my response videos. He's very harsh with people. In fact, probably beyond me. But I like him especially because he has a similar temperament to me. So what is skin in the game about? It's about skin in the game. So how much somebody's willing to put down for certain results, you know. So a preacher will have skin in the game related to his faith. Although Taleb goes into a lot more detail with this. So he talks about no skin in the game, soul in the game. So soul in the game would be someone like a bishop. Then you've got skin in the game, which might be, you know, a parishioner. You know, he has skin in the game related to the church. Whereas a priest will have soul in the game because he's literally sacrificed his ability to reproduce for the church. And he goes into a very, very high level of detail. It's an exceptionally useful book for people starting businesses. In fact, pretty much anything that Nicholas Nassim Taleb has written is very useful for people starting businesses. I have all of his books, actually, besides The Bed of Procrustes, because, frankly, I'm not spending 20 quid on 2 hours of aphorisms. But one very interesting thing that I found in it, and probably the most interesting thing I found in it, aside from, admittedly, him not really understanding how the church works in a particular passage, is his discussion of something called the Lindy effect, which is essentially, I won't explain it here, but basically it's the reason why you should probably be reading old books and ignoring new ones, with this one as the exception. Now, of course, you shouldn't skip the commentaries on those old books, but basically it explains why books persist, or how books will persist throughout time, and why we should read them. So, for example, if a book is still being read 200 years after its publication, there's a good chance it will still be read 200 years after that, because of the inherent value of the work. So, it's just well worth reading this book. It's incredible. The third book I'll recommend is about Thomas Aquinas, but isn't actually Thomas Aquinas. Because for anybody who's attempted to read the Summa Theologiae just as it is, there's a lot of very complicated vocabulary which people in the modern era can't understand. We have to remember this book was written over 700 years ago. Well, these volumes were. And personally, a lot of people will recommend Edward Fazer, which is incredible. Like, The Last Superstition is a very interesting book. But the one that started me off with St. Thomas Aquinas was St. Thomas Aquinas in the Modern Scholar series by Dr. Peter Kreeft. Now, Peter Kreeft is the exact opposite of Nicholas Nassim Taleb. He's a very well-spoken, very nice old man. He just oozes this kind of, just kindness that Taleb and I don't really. He goes through Aquinas and explains, the very basics of his theology in, admittedly, times where you have to listen through or read through a couple of times in order to truly get it. But he does it in such a way that isn't quite as thorough as Aquinas, but also covers a lot of the different points. So he covers Aquinas' anthropology and psychology, as well as the arguments for the existence of God. Whereas if you were to read through Aquinas, I looked into the amount of questions that were in the Summa, and you'd be there for about 2 years. Whereas Kreeft breaks down this work into about 7 or 8 hours of audio, so maybe a 300-page book. And obviously he doesn't go into the same level of detail, but he gives you sort of a general overview, which I think is necessary if we're going to be studying these primary sources, if they're so long. I picked it up on Audible, so if you guys want to go onto Audible, I'm not going to shill for them because they're not giving me anything back, but you can find it on there. Now, this is actually the first book that I had outside of my house. So I moved out of my parents' house about 3 years ago, and now I've got about 4 crates of books. But this book is the book that I started with, and that is Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. And it's this autobiographical account of a German stormtrooper fighting in the First World War. Ernst Jünger was pretty much indisputably a hero, and he is worth reading in pretty much all of his works. He has some bizarre, very modernist takes, but I think this is the sort of thing that you see in a lot of people who are veterans of the First World War. For example, Hitler, and you see it also in Evola, and you see it in Guénon, and you see it in even the English and French writers. The one who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, whose name does not quite flash into my head, had this similar sort of bizarre modernist undertone to them. I believe that Father Ripperger actually talked about a specific generational spirit affecting the people who fought in that war, and it's definitely self-evident here, but this is often in his other works and not so much in Storm of Steel, because Storm of Steel is effectively just stating the war of how it was. It's very, very brutal, but it doesn't go to the level of defaming the war as pointless, like something like All Quiet on the Western Front. It's very, very objective, and he goes into the details about the specific things that happened without really casting moral judgment. For example, he talks about advancing into a French trench after an attack and seeing a headless French soldier still at the shooting point with his rifle in his hands, with his hands still in the position to shoot his Lebel rifle, and all sorts of gory things, like him finding his dying brother on the field and rescuing him and saving his life. It's a very, very interesting and poignant tale. Is definitely worth the read, and it's a shame that there are no audiobooks of it. Also, another thing I'd recommend just as sort of an extra on top of the Storm of Steel is On Pain, which is an essay I read for the Renaissance Man program, and it essentially shows us not only his perspective on pain according to a sort of a quasi-Nietzschean worldview, but also how he thinks things will develop and how we will get as... he essentially details what he thinks the last man will be as Nietzsche defined him. So in other words, he essentially describes the bug man in a lot of ways. But anyway, just go and read Storm of Steel, even if you don't read any of his philosophical essays because they're a bit weird. Go and read Storm of Steel, because it's well worth it, and it's the reason why he's famous. I'm of the very strong opinion that everyone should possess this fifth book. If you ignore everything else, aside from maybe Confessions, and buy this, you will have something great. And that is the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, and specifically the one translated by Benedicta Ward. Now, these are basically short stories and sayings about morality from 4th and 5th century monks living in the Egyptian and Palestinian deserts. And they are incredible. They're well worth having because it's very potent meditation material. This isn't the kind of thing that you read through cover to cover. I haven't read this through cover to cover because it doesn't make much sense. Now, there are two versions that you can get. The first version, which is the one I'm not recommending, is the alphabetical version, which goes through the fathers in alphabetical order, so you can look up Abba Moses or Abba Bessarion and find the sayings of the particular saints in there. The one I'm recommending, specifically the one translated by Benedicta Ward, is the one grouped by use of the sayings. So you can get sayings on humility, sayings on resisting lust, sayings on compunction, and things like this. And you can go through the book and you can find a particular saying and meditate on it and internalize it. And initially, particularly if you're an especially secular person, the sayings will shock you. For example, there's one particular saying on fortitude where a saint called Saint Arsenius, or Abba Arsenius, is talking about how a monk, if he is a fighter, will be able to sleep 1 hour a night. Now, this initially seems like hyperbole, and then you start reading into what the saints actually did, because there are other ones like Abba Bessarion, who stayed up for 40 days amidst thorns to fight off sleep. And a lot, like a secular reader will think that these are purely fairy stories. And for most people they are, but these men, and also hundreds of saints throughout the ages, have done these sorts of things. And of course they're very difficult. but they nonetheless happen. A lot of these men have a certain superhuman aspect to them. But this was written by a contemporary, a guy called Pelagius. You may have heard of him. And yes, that Pelagius wrote these sayings and collected them together in the Latin, and they were translated by Benedict Ward. But yes, get it. It's incredible. There are other works in Christianity like it, like the Philokalia of the Eastern Orthodox tradition is somewhat like this, but I'd stay away from it if you're a Catholic, because a lot of it is post-schism material and is therefore kind of erroneous. We need a Catholic Philokalia, really. Again, I return with a book which is also very, very modern. I think it's slightly older than the book Skin in the Game, by, of course, Taleb. But this is something that sounds like the kind of thing that you'd buy in a bargain bin at like a Barnes & Noble or a Waterstones. We don't have Barnes & Noble in the UK, by the way, we have Waterstones. And that is The Millionaire Fastlane by M.J. DeMarco. Now, of course, the title sounds like crap, but the content is very good for this moment right now. There are other financial books like The Intelligent Investor, which I haven't quite got my way through, which are useful just generally. But this book is very much in the moment. And the idea behind this book is how to go about establishing a business in the modern world. So, how would you treat distribution systems, for example? Would you use, I don't know, social media or your own website or stuff like that? But it also, through the story, teaches a lot about the virtues required to establish this business. It describes planning. It describes how to market a product in abstract. It's generally very useful, and I've internalized a lot of it. It's also quite a long book. I've listened through it twice, and it's about 14 hours, if I recall correctly, the audio tape. So it's quite a dense book. It's not perhaps as useful as the other books on this list, but it's very good in the moment, right here, right now. And there's a reason why it's recommended a lot by YouTube channels, because it's one of the more useful books. Like Robert Kiyosaki's book, what was it called? Rich Dad, Poor Dad. That's useful somewhat, but it's not quite as useful as Millionaire Fastlane, because I mean, a lot of the stuff in Kiyosaki's book is what M.J. DeMarco calls slow lane, so the sort of middle class, way of thinking where you save 10% and then you invest. Whereas M.J. DeMarco is about trying to maximize profit as quickly as possible in the modern world. Because ultimately the way we get rich is by maximizing the amount of money coming in, not by minimizing the amount going out. Because if you earn, say, £800 a week, you may retain £200 more if you cut your life out, but it's a lot better to earn £1,400 a week. And that's the context of this book. I haven't listened to it in quite a while, but it's certainly something that I found very useful. And it's something that I would argue is one of the central texts of modern business creation, alongside books that I've got on my list, like The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, which is a book that I would recommend everyone read as well, just as an aside, purely to understand how these tech magnates are thinking, because it does not look good for them in that book. If there's one book that I can put down to my conversion, it would be Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Now, very interestingly, Gilbert Chesterton, as his first name is, wrote this while he was an Anglican. But it very much details what Christianity really is in essence, in a way far better than something like C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I remember reading Mere Christianity. I think I even did a podcast on it, and I was thoroughly disappointed with the book. And after that, I read Orthodoxy on the recommendation of a friend, and it's a far meatier, far more perhaps irascible take than Lewis's book, because Lewis is very feelingsy when he wrote the book, whereas GK starts it out with criticism. He starts it out by laughing at people who believe in themselves. He says something along the lines of,
the only people who truly believe in themselves are in asylums. And he starts tearing into the infinitely small circle that materialists are sort of trapped in. It's a very beautiful book, and probably the best way to start reading Chesterton, because Chesterton wrote a lot of very interesting things. For example, his History of England is very, very fun, although it has a kind of a somber tone because it was written during the First World War. And there's also Heretics, which is more of a collection of essays. But Orthodoxy is a book that you should all read. I've read it about 3 times. The Maniac is probably the best part of the book, and it's the start, and it grabs you in immediately. It's utterly confrontational and very funny, and it's one of the few books that I've actually read and laughed out loud at, because of the way that Chesterton sort of has this paradoxical way of describing things and this very witty sense of humour to it. It's really, really good. And it was in fact probably the first book that I've ever found that I've laughed at. Because a lot of books are intensely serious, like if you read Friedrich Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, which Chesterton often mocks, it's this very intensely serious kind of almost fedora kind of book, although obviously probably worth reading in of itself just to understand how the modern age has been shaped. But it's an inherently funny book, and also very right. There's a reason why they call G.K. Chesterton the Apostle of Common Sense. Seriously, go and read it and buy it on Amazon, because you can get cheap copies of it for about $5 on there. Because there's modern publications of it, because it's such a good book.
The 8th book I'm going to recommend is something that most of you will probably find pretty self-evident, right? And that is How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, I read this about 2 years ago now, and I found about 70% of the titles of the chapters pretty self-evident, like saying please and thank you, and, not like saying I don't blame you one iota for, a particular action if it's like something that people need reassurance on. Essentially, it's a book on relating with people. It's a book on talking to people and how to specifically, influence them. And it's very, very detailed. There's a reason why pretty much all of our political leaders have read it, since it was first written in the early 20th century, around the same time as people like Napoleon Hill were writing. And unlike Napoleon Hill, who wrote largely relating to businesses, Dale Carnegie did actual seminars and wrote books on specifically how to do public relations and how to be a decent rhetorician. He didn't go into so much detail about specific rhetorical techniques like someone like Aristotle did, but he talked about generally how to handle interpersonal relations in a useful way. And he goes into quite a lot of detail on this. It's a long book. It's like an average paperback, and it goes through things that are seemingly very basic, but goes into a lot of detail about it. And I think that people, particularly on our end of the political spectrum, or for some of you on your end of the autistic spectrum, would really benefit from this, because it explains pretty categorically how to do things. Now, like I say, the majority of the people watching, you'll find about 70 to 80% of it effectively self-evident. I did. But it's that additional knowledge that Dale Carnegie brings out and actualizes, which is important to understand, and that's why people like Bill Clinton, a man who is decidedly not autistic, read it and memorized it. It was precisely for that reason. And that's why I'd recommend everyone read it. Number 9 is another book from the early 20th century, and it is The Crisis of the Modern World by René Guénon. Now, there's often the meme of going and reading Evola in our circles. The difference between René Guénon and Julius Evola is that René Guénon says in 50 pages what Evola says in 500. This man was a Gnostic, and he died a Sufi. But I think that his insights, a lot of these insights in his book, are very, very useful for Catholics. He was born a Catholic and in a lot of ways thinks like us. Kind of like Evola, but less weird. At least he remained within the Abrahamic faiths. He made me, before I was Catholic, truly realise what tradition was. Because a lot of people, and I used to think, that tradition was something that was external. I used to think it was saying particular prayers at a given moment in a service. I used to think that the antithesis of it was, say, women altar service and stuff like that. But really, tradition is something far more complex than that. It's, as he describes it, it is a kind of a living being, a kind of a spiritual... I want to use a word that isn't gestalt, but a sort of a spirit that emerges out of a group of people doing something, in a way. Like a gestalt. I mean, obviously the body of Christ as in the church is different in that it is the mystical body of Christ, but generally traditions function in that way. Now, he goes into detail about this, and it's a pretty good description of it, I think. He's clearly a very clever, if a little bit of a weird man. But also, I found one of the insights that stuck with me from the book, especially, was how he thought that one of the major reasons why the West broke down, aside from Protestantism, was this autistic division of study. So you have the natural sciences divided into, chemistry, physics, and biology. Whereas before, this was all linked together and all ultimately came out of metaphysics, which was taught with it as well. And he talks about this. He said, the only reason that you've got these ridiculous hobbled faiths, and you see this with Protestantism as well, with groups like Pentecostals and Taborites and stuff like that, it's this division of... I suppose in a sense it would be division of labour, but it was more a division of study, because people would study the arm and leg without studying the entire body and corpus of, studies. They wouldn't ground it in, sane metaphysics first, because of how they would work on, specific subjects at the ignorance of others. And he says that we should remedy this in order to retain a culture, and he says that at the time he's writing, this is before the Chinese Communist Revolution, I believe, he believes that the East is one of the few places where this is sort of retained, although in a far less potent form than the West ever had it. And so he writes this book to, explain how the West is overthrowing traditional cultures. The final book I'll recommend, and this is another very useful one, is The Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. And this isn't the sort of book that you can read very quickly. You can only really start with the first book of it, which I've finished in its entirety, if you're a beginner, and then you work your way through it quite slowly as you gain spiritual proficiency in Christianity. And it's part of a series of these books that John of the Cross wrote. He started with The Ascent of Mount Carmel. I mean, The Ascent of Mount Carmel is the logical start of where he writes, and then he writes into Dark Night of the Soul, and then The Spiritual Canticle, and then finally The Living Flame of Love. And essentially what these books are books on how to overcome sin and overcome imperfection. They're essentially books that explain how you overcome sin. And he does it in this exceptional detail, in this dense, exceptional detail. There's a difference in the details between John of the Cross, who's the mystical doctor of the Catholic Church, and Aquinas. Aquinas is difficult because he uses a lot of complicated vocabulary and very, very, dense philosophical constructs. St. John of the Cross, when he writes, is difficult because he's writing in such a way that has so much meaning compressed into so few words. He was a poet by profession, and so he was very much apt at this. The writing of poems so they could be interpreted in multiple different ways in order to get multiple different conclusions, and ultimately valid ones as well. And these books are essentially expounding on those poems. So, for example, The Ascent of Mount Carmel is a poem that he wrote, and he goes through the different stanzas of the poems, explaining the different lines, but also cobbling on additional things to explain the meaning behind them and therefore allow us to develop spiritually. It's not a straightforward thing. There are other books like The Ways of Mental Prayer and The Spiritual Combat which are far more straightforward and easy to understand. They're the sort of things that don't require quite as much in the way of meditation on to understand. But John of the Cross is far richer than those works because it is so dense and it is so mystical. And I don't mean mystical in this antsy schmancy kind of new agey kind of spirit way. I mean this ultimate Christian mysticism. Like, it kind of annoys me. This is somewhat of an aside. How mysticism has become conflated with this kind of self-indulgent, well, frankly, faggotry from the New Age movement, when really mysticism is so much more than that. People like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross are examples of this, as the people who are essentially the tip of the spear of post-Reformation Catholic spiritual life. So those are 10 books that I'd recommend everyone read. Hopefully they're useful, and hopefully I've expounded them accurately here. Some of these books I haven't read for a few years, so I might not have gone into as much detail as I could, or perhaps even presented inaccuracies about them. But nonetheless, I got a lot out of these books, regardless of their authors. And therefore, I would suggest that you should all read them as well. I'm partly expecting people to be surprised just how many sort of self-help-esque kind of books I've recommended, things like How to Win Friends and Influence People. But, you know, when you look through enough of the business blogs and you see people yelling about reading these books, at a certain point you're just like, right, I'll go and read them. And then you read them and you gain a lot from them. A lot of the self-improvement books are kind of shit, to be honest, and you should avoid them. But there are some gems there that you want to pay attention to. So again, I hope this was useful. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye. I'd like to thank the people on the Renaissance Man program who you'll see on screen. They've helped me so much over the last couple of months, and hopefully they've received good and satisfactory content from the Renaissance Man program, which you can find in the description of the video. Thank you very much for watching.